Welcome back. I hope you took a few minutes to stretch your legs and grab a break there. We are excited that you're joining us for this next session about ways to participate in the science of Sanfilippo outside of treatment trials. And you heard in the last two talks about some upcoming ways that's some opportunities for that. I'm going to share a message with you here, and following that, you'll hear a presentation by Dr. Thomas Blanchard, director at the University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank, who will inform us of some really important opportunities and unique resources. Thank you. As a parent, I know that treatment trials are... Hello, I'm Dr. Cara O'Neill, and in this session, we'll be talking about ways to participate in science beyond treatment trials. As a parent, I know that treatment trials are so incredibly important and are essentially a lifeline for many of our children. Unfortunately, we all know that there are woefully few spots and opportunities to participate in treatment trials. So I want to take a moment to say that while we're waiting for our opportunity to try experimental therapies, there are absolutely ways that we can help push forward the science, contribute, and be part of the solution. One of these ways is participating in what we all kind of know as natural history studies. Natural history studies are a type of observational study. They can be conducted in either a prospective or retrospective manner, or sometimes a combination of the two. In prospective studies, this is often what we think of as a natural history study. The information is collected from patients in a forward-looking manner. Patients may fill out surveys or go to clinical sites and have tests done over time and go to the site, or they may be done virtually. One of the most expansive studies done on Sanfilippo type B is run by the company Alevex. This is a multi-center study, and patients have been participating in this for over 4 years now that this study has been running and accumulating an incredible amount of data on this form of the disease. Another opportunity that is coming up is through the Lysosomal Disease Network. And this is a consortium that is funded by the National Institutes of Health. This study of broadly across MPS disorders does include Sanfilippo, and it is broken down into a number of sub-studies focused on specific aspects of disease, such as neurocognition, social and emotional health and behavior, neuroimaging of the brain, the heart, and other physical symptoms that occur. Some of these sub-studies are going to be conducted in a virtual manner, while others are at various clinical sites. I would encourage anybody interested to reach out to Brenda Dietem-Okita at the University of Minnesota, who is coordinating these efforts, and her email is there, or always feel free to reach out to us at Cure Sanfilippo Foundation, contact at curesanfilippofoundation.org. You've also heard about some other upcoming opportunities for observational studies that will be happening. And as new potential therapies and partners enter the space, we're hopeful that there will be more opportunities in the future. Retrospective studies are another way to gain information about the history of the disease and how it progresses over time. A limitation of these retrospective studies is that the information may not have been collected in the same way and at the same frequency. And so it can make it a little bit more difficult to interpret the findings, particularly specific aspects of the disease. However, we can still learn a lot from looking backward. And they may use resources such as case reports or previous studies that have already been published, and then pull data out of that to reanalyze with a new research question. There are also insurance databases, pharmacy databases, and medical records that can be accessed. And we can query those databases and records using new research questions. Cure Sanfilippo is partnered with All Stripes to look at medical records and access data from them to be analyzed for research. And families have graciously enrolled in this program where they are actually able to see all of their medical records as well. So it does provide a benefit to the family. Some interim data on that cohort of Sanfilippo patients was shared this past winter at the World Symposium, where they looked at general distribution of patients that were enrolled, median age of diagnosis, and so on. Deeper insights will be extracted from the medical records, and we have now completed phase 1 of recruitment, which is wonderful, with over 50 patients enrolled and consented for research. Data abstraction is underway, and we look forward to being able to share some of those insights early next year. So aside from enrolling in a study, retrospective or prospective, that I've already described, simply sharing your thoughts and insights can really move the needle in research. And this is done through surveys, interviews, focus groups, through informal feedback, and more formal feedback mechanisms. An example of the impact of providing insights and feedback really is something that we've seen happen as data from our Sanfilippo caregiver preference study that was led by Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and conducted with the scientific expertise of RTI International has led to 2 peer-reviewed publications now. It has also informed a number of clinical trials in development and one underway, which is the anakinra drug repurposing study. The ability to actually understand what's meaningful to families is incredibly important to guide and steer what outcome measures we choose to measure in clinical trials and how we're ultimately going to determine if a treatment is successful and beneficial or not. So having that insight from caregivers is incredibly meaningful. Like I said, these 2 publications have come out, and we have another manuscript in publication. You may have also seen throughout the conference tidbits shared from our data and those insights from families. Again, that much of those collected through online surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And in conclusion, I would like to just briefly touch on tissue donation as a way to support Sanfilippo research. This can be done through the natural history studies, as I've described before, when you go and have your blood taken or share a urine sample or some other sample. There are also more specific research studies that may not be a very broad natural history study, but may collect samples from patients who are having a clinical procedure and the family just agrees to share maybe a piece of bone if they're having orthopedic surgery, or a sample of lung sputum if they're having an intubation. But we also have samples that can be donated after a child passes away. And it's really hard to think about, honestly, as I know this as a parent, it's hard to go there. However, it is truly the most precious gift that a family can consider giving, and one that is incredibly important for advancing knowledge about Sanfilippo syndrome and is critical in moving towards treatments and understanding how to move forward. The Brain and Tissue Bank at the University of Maryland is a wonderful resource, and our next speaker will talk more about that with you. So I'd like to thank families who really give of themselves to advance the science. Every one of you who fills out a survey, who shares your advice, who enrolls in an observational study that really doesn't provide benefit to your child, know that we realize that is a sacrifice and that is a contribution to the greater good. And so we thank you and we thank your children for helping to make a difference.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. This is a wonderful conference and well organized, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak to you today. I'm hoping that our tissue bank can help meet a need for both the families and the researchers in the Sanfilippo community. I'm the director of the University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank here in Baltimore, Maryland. And I'd like to speak to you today about how we might advance your cause and why we are, I think, the bank that's best suited to help advance your cause. Next slide, please. This is just an image of our university, and the bank here is located in the Department of Pediatrics, and that's not common for brain banks. But the reason it's located in the Department of Pediatrics is because from its inception, this bank was designed to collect tissue and advance research for children and infants with rare disorders and neurologic disorders. Next slide, please. Before I talk in detail about the University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank, I have to talk about the NIH Neurobiobank. And some of you may have heard about the Neurobiobank and wonder what the relationship is between some of the individual banks and the Neurobiobank. The Neurobiobank was established in 2013 as a resource for investigators to meet a need in the neuroscience community. There was a lack of human tissue available for neurologic research, and the NIH started this Neurobiobank in 2013 to meet this need. It serves as a central point of access to the world-class collections of 6 different biorepositories, and it's funded by multiple NIH institutes, including the Institute of Mental Health, Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke, Institute on Aging, Institute on Drug Abuse, and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Next slide, please. So the mission of the bank was twofold. One was to provide a mechanism by which families can donate tissue for research, to make it as easy and practical as possible. And on the other hand, to provide researchers access to human tissue to better understand human disease, and to accelerate research to improve the treatment, cure, and prevention of developmental and neurologic disorders. Next slide, please. As I said, the Neurobiobank is a federation of 6 different tissue banks, all of which existed prior to 2013 with their own independent funding from the NIH. Those include our bank at the University of Maryland, a bank at the University of Miami, the Harvard Brain Bank, Mount Sinai Brain Bank, the UCLA Brain and Spinal Fluid Resource Center, and the University of Pittsburgh Brain Tissue Donation Program. However, these banks, before the inception of the Neurobiobank and with the inception of the Neurobiobank, really focus predominantly on adult neurologic disorders with a heavy emphasis on dementias and other diseases such as Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and ALS. Next slide, please. All 6 banks support a wide variety of research, and tissues requested from the banks can be used for a wide variety of research, limited only by the imaginations of the researchers requesting tissue. Tissue is routinely requested, perform imaging, histology studies to look at microscopic structures in the cells on thin sections, single cell analysis. Fibroblasts are often cultured from skin biopsies to perform in vitro work in cell culture. Proteins are studied, receptors, metabolites, and more recently, as you can imagine, gene expression and whole genome sequencing is being employed, in addition to the distribution of medical data, which we collect on all donors and distribute freely in a redacted form. Next slide, please. The University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank is a little bit different than the other banks in the consortium. We were initially funded by the NICHD in 1991 with the express mission of serving the infant and pediatric community. We were asked to join the Neurobiobank in 2014 to increase their archive size and to expand the types of diseases that were available to researchers requesting tissue. And our mission has been and remains broader than most of those other brain and tissue banks. The University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank systematically collects, stores, and distributes tissue for research dedicated to the improved understanding, care, and treatment of individuals of all ages with neurologic, psychiatric, developmental, metabolic, and movement disorders. Next slide, please. This is an image of part of the bank just to make the point that we have a very state-of-the-art and secure facility. Those that entrust their tissues to us have a reasonable expectation that that tissue will be handled respectfully and carefully. Anybody in the brain banking or the tissue banking industry for very long has heard stories about freezer failures and loss of precious tissue. Our bank employs a number of redundant backup systems as well as multiple alarm systems to alert us in case any freezer rises in temperature and puts the tissue in danger, giving us plenty of time to rectify the situation. Next slide, please. Our disorders of interest are very broad, and this slide just illustrates a small subsection of the types of diseases we routinely collect, listed in alphabetical order, and you can see that includes Sanfilippo syndrome. We specialize in the collection of rare disorders, and we willingly work with organizations and patients and families that are suffering from these rare disorders. Next slide, please. Rare disorders are essential to our mission, and whereas we do embrace the mission of the Greater Neurobiobank and collect tissue from older subjects and those with dementia, rare disorders really are our primary goal. They're not so rare. There are over 7,000 rare diseases and disorders. People with rare diseases have tremendous unmet needs, including misdiagnosis and often a long journey to finally receiving a correct diagnosis. 95% have no treatment or cure, as this audience well knows. Next slide, please. So here are some of the important elements of the NIH Neurobiobank. And there are many banks, many tissue banks, and there are many brain banks outside of the Neurobiobank. But the Neurobiobank truly is unique. Number one is cost. There are never charges or fees to donate or receive tissue. There are absolutely no costs associated with donating tissue. The inventory is very large. You'll have ready access to samples from all 6 banks, representing over 10,000 cases. And in fact, that number is closer to 20,000 now. Maryland itself houses over 5,000 cases of donated tissue. Information, it's a rich source of information. For each case, we seek medical records. We provide a neuropathology report. We perform toxicology and serology, and when available, we receive autopsy reports. And of course, we have questionnaires completed by the donor or the donor's families. This information, again, is readily available to researchers upon request in a redacted form. We have a very easy to use interface for researchers searching for the tissue that's available, and service. We have very responsive personnel at the Neurobiobank to help researchers working with the portal, as well as the individual banks, whether they're working with donors and donors' families or with researchers in the act of getting tissue. Next slide, please. So when we talk about donating tissue to the bank, we really stress a few points. One is that tissue and organ donation is accepted by most religious organizations. And more importantly to many donors is that a traditional funeral service may be planned as the procedure to recover tissue, and by tissue in this instance, I mean brain, will not interfere with open casket viewing. There's a small caveat with that, whereas newborns and very young infants, that can be challenging, but we have yet to receive a complaint from anyone who's donated tissue with regards to this matter. Anyone, regardless of age, is invited to donate. And something I typically fail to mention, but I think is important, is that registration to donate in no way obligates someone to donate. It simply makes it such that the process goes much easier in the event of passing. But there's no reason after registering to have to go through with donating the tissue. Next slide, please. As I said before, there is no cost to the donor or the donor's next of kin. The bank makes all arrangements for tissue recovery. The bank arranges to find a tissue recovery technician and a place for the recovery to occur. The bank arranges for transport, if necessary, of the donor's body and covers the cost of that transport. Recoveries can include the brain as well as systemic tissue. Not very few banks that specialize in the brain are also willing or able to systematically collect tissue from soft organs and throughout the body. Pre-registration is best. It allows us to make arrangements before passing occurs, and it makes things go smoothly and ultimately is less stressful on the family. However, donation can be arranged if the bank is contacted in a timely fashion after death. Next slide, please. So how to register? There are two options to register. You can register to donate either through the Neurobiobank or Maryland itself. If you are going to register through the Neurobiobank, you can go to their website, and when you click on the donor button, you'll be directed to this page within their website, which brings you to this button for the Brain Donor Project. The Brain Donor Project is a foundation that was developed with the sole goal of facilitating registration for brain donation for the Neurobiobank. Next slide, please. If you contact the Neurobiobank, the Brain Donor Project, they will take some information and they will route your case to one of the 4 banks which can recover tissue nationwide, depending on where you live in the country. That bank would then send you a registration packet, and then you would complete that packet and return it to the bank, and then you would be pre-registered. Next slide, please. What you can see in yellow here is what we call the catchment area for the University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank. And so those individuals who live in these 10 states or Washington, D.C., should they call the Neurobiobank to register, would be automatically routed to the University of Maryland. Next slide, please. I will say, however, that because the nature of the disease we're talking about is Sanfilippo disease, that when you call, even if you went to the Neurobiobank, you would automatically be routed to the University of Maryland Brain and Tissue Bank because we're the one bank of the 6 that will readily accept these cases. So whether or not you're in our catchment area, your case will end up with our personnel. The yellow states represent all the states from which we recovered tissue in our previous contract period, which ended in 2019. Next slide, please. And even though there were some states from that contract period where no brains were recovered, we are capable of recovering brains from all over the country. And this slide demonstrates the number of donors that were pre-registered with Maryland's bank at the end of our previous contract period. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's how to work with the Neurobiobank. You can work with us directly by going to our website. You can call our phone number and talk to one of our tissue project coordinators directly, or you can go to our website, hit donor, and you'll end up on this page where you can register. You can enter a few fields and submit that information, which will be sent to us, or provide that information to us over the phone. Next slide, please. So the registration process is that we would be contacted by phone or by online submission, and then we would send a packet out to the donor or the donor's family, which would include the consent document, the patient privacy documents, a questionnaire, and that information can be completed at your leisure and then returned to our project coordinators, and then you will be registered. And then nothing else would happen until the donor passes, at which point you would call and we would set things in motion. Next slide, please. This slide is from our previous contract period, and it's simply to illustrate the percentage of donors that work with us directly. That fraction of the bar represents the number of donors that came to us through the Brain Donor Project. All other colors combined represent those donors that contacted us directly. And so either way works, and we're happy to take them either routed through the Brain Donor Project or ourselves. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to answer more questions about donation in the question and answer period. But now I would like to speak about requesting tissue as a researcher from the Neurobiobank. This is a page you would see if you went to the Neurobiobank portal and hit the researcher button. You would be brought to this step-by-step tutorial on how to order tissue. You'd have to create an account, which requires uploading a PDF of your CV and establishing a material transfer agreement between your institution and the Neurobiobank that is facilitated by the Neurobiobank website with a boilerplate MTA document. And if you need help, you can email the contact person and receive help. Next slide, please. Okay. Just as a matter of convention, this is true for all the banks within the Neurobiobank and as well as those brain banks outside of the Neurobiobank. In general, the right hemisphere is fixed in a chemical preservative, and the left hemisphere is frozen before being separated into smaller parts for distribution and long-term storage. And so whether your research needs involved fixed tissue or frozen tissue, as different techniques require, that tissue would be available to you. Next slide, please. As a researcher, you would submit your request along with some justification for the request and to demonstrate sound science to the Neurobiobank, and the request is then routed to the appropriate bank. And once it's shuttled to the appropriate bank, you would then work with the tissue coordinators who will process your order. And that turns out to be a very personal discussion. You can email and call and talk at length. And what is frequently the case is that the tissue coordinators will work with you to make sure you're getting the regions and the amount of tissue you need from the right donors. And they may even help you identify donors or tissues that you hadn't considered in the first place. Next slide, please. I put this slide in to make the point that we do distribute a lot of non-brain tissue, and it's a very big part of what we do. On a year-to-year basis, you can see represented in the orange part of these bars the percentage of tissue that we distribute that is non-brain. And the list of tissues on the right-hand side of this image shows you the breadth of systemic tissue that we do distribute. And this is not an exhaustive list. It just happens to be the tissue samples types that we distributed during those time periods. Next slide, please. I apologize that this is a little small. It's a screenshot of a simple search that I performed on the Neurobiobank website as an illustration. So what I've done is in the upper left-hand corner in the search engine, I simply typed in Sanfilippo, and all the cases in the Neurobiobank that were Sanfilippo showed up on this spreadsheet. And you can see in this instance, they're showing race, subject age, subject sex. You can refine your search and narrow things down. You can select for patients in which genetics have been performed. You can select based on individual banks and so forth. So this search is very flexible. And once you get to know how to use this search engine, it's quite powerful. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the other tab, which is the display tab, and you can see the same cases are being shown here. And you can choose here what to display about each case. And here you see the race, the subject sex, the subject age, results of neuropathology diagnosis, the repository. But for instance, you may have on the left selected brain region. And if you had selected that, another column would appear. And all the brain regions that are still available from that individual donor would be listed in a cell in another column. So you can really navigate through this website. It's a very powerful way to select the cases and the tissues that you need. Next slide, please. I put this slide up here to illustrate how busy we are and how important I think we are to this pediatric community. This is from last year. It's data from the NIH from last year. Each bar represents the number of samples that were requested from each of the banks within the Neurobiobank. And you can see that the University of Maryland, almost 8,000 different samples were requested from our bank. One of the reasons that demand is so heavy from our bank is because, number one, we tend to have a lot more control cases than other banks, which is important for those needing a comparative group to study their disease. We also, as I showed you, tend to have a higher amount of systemic tissue or non-brain tissue than the other banks. But most importantly, this just demonstrates the importance of the rare diseases and the pediatric populations that we're serving, because all those requests are coming to Maryland to fill those cases. And I can tell you that as recently as 2 weeks ago, we received compliments from the Neurobiobank directors about the timeliness with which our tissue coordinators are able to complete and fill these orders on the researchers' behalfs. So I'm confident that we can meet your needs when they arise. Next slide, please. I'll just leave you with this quote, which the previous director would often post from one of our consultants, which is that some diseases are uniquely human and ultimately require the study of human tissue. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blanchard. That was a really wonderful talk with tons of important information. It's always a difficult topic for families, and something that, you know, is hard to process when you're going through, you know, the grief of end of life. And so having that information up front so people can consider it. And certainly it's not something that everyone chooses to do, but at least we have the information to consider. So it's really important. Thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions. You mentioned healthy control tissue. So, you know, the question is it important to have donations from healthy family members of patients? So, you know, maybe multiple people in the family decide to donate at some point.
That's a great question. Controls are remarkably important. And when they come from a family member, that's on top of that, it's extremely important. We make that notation. That becomes part of the record. And so that's a case where if you're a researcher requesting tissue and control tissues, where a researcher might bring those specific control cases to the attention of the researcher. So yes, that's invaluable when available.
Okay. There's another question about, you know, the experimental trials that are going on. And, you know, currently there is not therapy in Sanfilippo, but, you know, hopefully we are going to get there before long. But some of the therapies that are non-reversible in the sense of gene therapy or bone marrow transplant, or, you know, maybe other things we haven't even thought of yet. Are those patients still coming to you? Number one is part of the question. And then I have another question after that. Well, I'll let you take that first.
We would willingly accept those patients, and I have to believe that those would be of great interest to the scientist to kind of monitor what was going on during that therapy. So they don't obviously come to us automatically, but were they offered to us, we would willingly accept those samples.
Okay. I'm aware that in consents of some trials, in particularly gene therapy trials, but maybe multiple different avenues of treatment, that the consent forms do have wording in them that encourages you or says that you agree to an autopsy at the end of, should your child pass away after having received, a non-reversible therapy. However, there are really not logistics in place for that to happen. And it's kind of like it's a buried topic in there. And I think, have you ever had sponsors or investigators come to you to try to collaborate on that piece and say, okay, well, if the patient passes, can the biobank step in?
So we haven't worked with a study per se, but we've worked with physicians who have a population with a specific disease. And those physicians are in pretty good communication with us and routinely refer patients to us. And yes, there are times when the physician, if death becomes imminent, working with the family, gets in touch with us so that we can, when passing occurs, arrange for that.
Okay.
So we can be the ones to set up the autopsy.
Okay.
I do have to say that it would still require a separate consent on our part to be able to obtain the tissue.
Sure. Okay. There's opportunity for synergy and collaboration.
Yes.
That might make it easier for the patient and the family.
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Just want to recognize a family that shared their experience and that they've just decided to make a difficult but important choice to donate. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I think that's all of our questions for right now. Thank you, Dr. Blanchard, and we will take a break and be back in just a few minutes for our next session.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We are here for our second session on updates and active clinical trials. And very excited to have with us today Dr. Lynda Polgreen, Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and investigator at the Lundquist Institute. Her presentation will be followed by Dr. Ralph Laufer, Chief Scientific Officer at Lysogene. Dr. Laufer has shared a recorded presentation with us today because of our time differences. And any questions will be answered offline. But let's get started with Dr. Polgreen now.
All right. Hi, Cara. Thank you. And thank you so much for this invitation to come give an update on the clinical trial of anakinra and Sanfilippo syndrome. Before I get into the trial results, I just wanted to take a few minutes here at the beginning to acknowledge two really key people to allowing us to even get to day one of this trial. And the first person is Dr. Brian Bigger, who spoke this morning and shared with everyone the discoveries he and his team made on the important role of the inflammasome activation in Sanfilippo syndrome and probably other MPS disorders also. And as he mentioned this morning, they had found that if you increase levels of interleukin-1 receptor antagonist, which inhibits IL-1 from activating the receptor, the IL-1 receptor, or if you knock out the IL-1 receptor, they found decreases in hyperactivity, improvements in memory, and decreases in neuroinflammation. And so I just think it's really important for those of us that do the clinical trials to acknowledge the work that got us here. And Brian has been a really key and important collaborator, in particular with our discussions with the FDA, our IND application, which allowed us, the data from his lab really allowed us to convince the FDA that this was worth trying. So thank you, Dr. Bigger. The other person is Dr. Cara O'Neill. So Cara, she and I heard Dr. Bigger present his work 3-4 years ago at a world meeting and both got so excited about it and have been collaborating on this project ever since. Cara has just provided such a unique perspective as a scientist, a mother of a child with Sanfilippo syndrome, as well as a patient advocate. And so she too was really key in convincing the FDA that this was an important study to get going on. So thank you, Cara, as well. All right, so with that, let's move forward into the trial results. So next slide, please. So Dr. Iakovina showed this design schematic earlier today. This is a phase 1/2 study design, which means that we're looking, it's the first study in humans. We're looking at safety. We're looking at what the effective dose would be, along with some of the looking at the effects it has on some of the clinical outcomes as well. And so because it was the first study of its kind, we did not want to do a placebo-controlled trial, even though that is often an ideal study design in some ways, particularly as you're moving forward to trying to obtain approval for a drug. We felt like this first study needed to be open label. So everybody who participates in the study gets treated with anakinra. But because there's no placebo, we designed it to have an 8-week observational period before treatment and an 8-week observational period after treatment. And in this way, we can measure all the same outcomes over 8 weeks when they're not on treatment as when they're on treatment, and compare the change in those outcomes during treatment and during the observational periods. So as I said, this is a phase 2 study, and the phase 2 part really has a lot to do with figuring out the dose. And so we relied on a dose that was used in other pediatric populations, and also with discussions with Sobi, who's the pharmaceutical company that produces anakinra and has donated that to this study for free. And so through those discussions, we came up with a dose of 100 micrograms daily, and that's given subcutaneously. And that means just under the skin, kind of like an insulin injection. So a very small needle, but it is every day. And we started out with that dose because it is 1 shot daily. And at 8 weeks, we designed the trials such that if the 2 outcomes that that the parents, caregivers had chosen that were most important to them, if they had not both improved, then we increased the dose to 200 micrograms per day. And so that would mean 2 shots each day. So the other part that we've been looking at here is it even tolerable to give 1 or even 2 subcutaneous injections daily to children with Sanfilippo syndrome? Next slide. And so to date, we have enrolled 24 participants. Our primary outcome is after 8 weeks of treatment, and per protocol design, we need to have 20 people reach week 8. We have had 19 get there, but we have needed to roll 24 to get to that number of 20 at week 8. So the description here of the participants is just the baseline characteristics. And so the median age, so the most common age you could say, of participants is 9.7 years, and the age range is from 6 to 26 years. Got half and half male and females, an okay distribution of race, but predominantly white. And then in terms of the types for MPS, we have 20 of the participants have MPS 3A, 3 have MPS 3B, and 1 with MPS 3C. Next slide, please. And here's the study flow of the participants who have entered and where they're at in the trial in terms of the timing. So as I mentioned, we've assessed 24 for eligibility. We've excluded 1 participant, unfortunately, because they had persistent neutropenia, which means a absolute neutrophil count, so low white blood cell count, that was below the threshold that we had to include. The reason that's an exclusion criteria is because the anakinra is known to decrease the absolute neutrophil count, so it can cause neutropenia. The remainder 23 entered the study on day 1 after their 8-week observational period. And you can see here, we've had some people who have discontinued. And we've had 2 who have discontinued due to intolerability of the daily injections. And so some of those have been, it clearly takes 2 caregivers to do this each day. And, you know, sometimes if the second caregiver is unable to do that for whatever reason, and there's nobody else in the house to help out, it really becomes impossible, at least so far, it seems impossible to give the daily injections. We've had some loss to follow-up, which means that the families, we just stopped being able to contact them, so they've basically withdrawn on their own. And then there was 1 participant who we had to stop the medication because that ANC, so the neutrophil count, remained under 1,500. This was early in the trial, and since then we have learned and have discussed with the FDA that that cutoff was too high, and we've decreased it now to less than that. So as long as the ANC stays above 1,200, they can continue in the study. And since doing that, we have not had to discontinue intervention in anybody based on their absolute neutrophil count. We also withdrew 1 participant due to a grade 3 adverse event of increased agitation. It wasn't quite clear that it was directly related to anakinra, but the agitation was so significant after starting it and seemed to improve after that we did not restart the medication there. Besides those withdrawals, we've had 19 complete week 8 and 9 have completed the whole study through week 44. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first outcome I'm going to go through is one that was really designed, as I mentioned, in large part with the insight and the help of Dr. O'Neill. So this is, and looking at some of the other MPS trials, particularly the MPS 7 clinical trial that led to the approval of the enzyme. This is what we call the individual clinical response. What we did was we really wanted to tailor a lot of the outcomes in this trial to what was most important to the caregivers. So this study is unique and different than a lot of the trials that you've heard the last day or two that were focusing, they focus on the primary etiology of the disease, so their enzyme restorative therapies, enzyme restorative approaches, really looking at cognitive outcomes. This is a bit more, we've been calling it a palliative study. So the goal was really to improve the quality of life for the patients and their caregivers. And so since that was the goal, and we don't expect that this medication will cure the disease, The hope is that it will improve quality of life and potentially slow down disease progression. But so with that in mind, we really tailored the outcomes to the families. And so this one called the individual clinical response, the parents and caregivers chose 5 problems from this list here. And these items on the list of the problems were taken from the caregiver study that Cara described a little earlier today. And then the parents rated those 5 outcomes, those same 5 outcomes throughout the study. And they rated them on a 5-point Likert scale of about how stressful, how impactful that outcome has been on their life and their child's life. And so you can see here on the right, the figure of the data, and all the figures that I'll show going forward look similar to this, and that the green area is during anakinra treatment and the other area is observation. And so you can see in this figure, it has the mean or the average scores with the 95% confidence intervals around them. So the scores are pretty stable during our observational period in the beginning. And then you see a decrease, which is an improvement in these outcomes. So all of the studies, all the outcomes will look at decreasing means improvement, so less burdensome. And we see improvement pretty consistently over the 36 weeks. And then after stopping anakinra, a rebound with the worsening scores at week 44. Next slide, please. Another way we looked at the data, because of the incredible heterogeneity in the disease manifestations and stage of the disease in our population, was using this idea of a multi-domain responder index, which requires you to decide on a minimal clinically important difference. And that can be a little challenging to come up with. We spent a lot of time looking through the literature and trying to figure out what would be the most appropriate data to use for that. And I show here the references of what we used to come up with this. And so how this is used, if we go to the next slide, please, is that for each of these outcomes of fatigue, parental stress, pain, behavior, and sleep, for each individual person, if they improved by more than that minimal clinically important difference, it would be in here in black, included in black as improved. If there was the change was less than that MCID, then there's no change. And if it was worse than that minimal clinically important difference, then it's worsened. So you can see on this figure, on the x-axis are the number of participants. So 18 have gotten to week 8. And the black bars show you the number who have improved on each of those outcomes. And then the dark gray is no change, and the striped would be worsen. And when we looked at all the individuals, 13 of the 18 participants improved on one or more of these outcomes by week 8. And this was all on the lower 100 microgram dose. Next slide, please. And this just shows you the week 16 data. So here we have 15 participants that have made it to week 16. And again, black are the number of participants out of 15 who have improved more than that minimal clinically important difference. Gray, no change, and striped, worsened. And here, apologize, that should be 15. So 12 of 15 participants at week 16 have improved on one or more outcome. And this would be after increasing to 200 micrograms in those individuals who did not have a significant improvement at week 8. Next slide, please. And now just the individual scales that we looked at. The families completed the Sanfilippo behavior rating scale, and these are the results from that. Again, a decrease over time is an improvement in that scale. And these 6 clusters and domains that are measured in the SBRS are social, emotional, mood, executive function, fear, movement, and oral behaviors. And for all of these, we see a similar trend except for fear. So in all of them, similar to the ICR, you see a relatively stable mean score from screening to day 1, so before treatment, and then a gradual decrease in those scores or improvement through week 36 with a rebound or worsening after the 8 weeks off treatment. The one that we don't see this in is fear, and that was expected because fear is thought to be related to damage to the amygdala, which we did not hypothesize would be impacted by anakinra treatment. Next slide. And then some other outcomes that we looked at. We looked at pain using the non-communicating children's pain checklist, and sleep using the child sleep habits questionnaire, stooling was a questionnaire designed by Cara O'Neill that looks at the quality, the frequency, how much it interferes with daily life of stooling. And then parental stress is a survey called the Autism Parenting Stress Index, which is taken, which is well validated in autism, and we thought might be appropriate to use in this population as well. And here again, in all of these outcomes, we see similar patterns. So relatively stable scores from screening to day 1, with improvements or decreasing over time through week 36. And unfortunately, when we stop the medication, there seems to be a fairly quick rebound by week 44. Next slide, please. So to summarize, there's been no new safety concerns that we've identified that are not already known about treatment with anakinra. There have been no drug-related serious adverse events. In the interest of time, I didn't show those data, but so far things look good from a safety perspective. The preliminary data suggests that anakinra can improve one or more parent-caregiver reported behavioral and somatic symptoms in most participants. So 67% of participants improved in at least one outcome at week 8 on the lower 100 microgram dose, and 86% of participants improved in at least one outcome at week 16 after increasing those that had not responded at week 8 to 200. Next slide. And I'd just like to finish with acknowledgements of the entire study team who, again, it has taken so many people to make this study happen and to get it to where it's been. It started 2 months before COVID hit, and so we've had to be flexible and adjust some things, but we are getting through it. We are hoping to have our last 20th participant get to week 8 in just a few weeks, and that's only possible by this team of individuals. So at Lundquist, Dr. Michelini Jacobino, who you heard this morning, Dr. Agnes Chen, who is a pediatric neurologist, Youngju Pak is our statistician, Ana Luzzi, the postdoc, in Dr. Jacobino's lab, and Adolfo Morales, our study coordinator. It's also been incredibly helpful having Dr. Julie Isengard involved, who's clearly an expert in the neuropsychology of Sanfilippo syndrome and has really helped us from that perspective. And again, wanting to acknowledge Cara O'Neill and the funding from the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation. So they have funded this entire study and just made the whole experience much easier for the patients and their families. And SOBI, acknowledging them for providing the study drug, and especially thanks to the study participants and their families. I know we say this a lot, and I think we need to keep saying it because we ask a lot of them, and I really appreciate what they've all done to make this study successful. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
With MPS IIIA. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to give you an update on our clinical trial of LYSA-302 gene therapy in children with MPS IIIA. I'm going to start by a brief reminder on MPS IIIA, also known as Sanfilippo A disease. It's caused by a defect in a gene called SGSH, which encodes an enzyme of the same name, sulfoglucosamine sulfohydrolase, also known as heparan N-sulfatase. This enzyme is involved in the stepwise metabolism of heparan sulfate. And as a consequence of deficiency of this enzyme or of low enzymatic activity, heparan sulfate will accumulate in cells and eventually become toxic. The cells that are most vulnerable to heparan sulfate toxicity are neurons, in particular neurons in the brain. The disease leads to progressive cognitive and motor decline, severe behavioral disturbances, and a shortened life expectancy with relatively mild somatic symptoms. So Lysogene's approach is to administer a gene therapy vector called LYSA-302 directly into the brain, which is the major site of pathology. The vector is an AAVrh10 capsid that contains the SGSH coding sequence under the control of a CAG promoter. And in order to bypass the blood-brain barrier, we inject LYSA-302 directly into the brain parenchyma at 6 different sites just below the surface of the cortex, into white matter fiber tracts. And we and others have shown that this method is really the most efficient method to bypass the blood-brain barrier and to achieve very good transgene expression throughout the brain, as shown here in this experiment done in monkeys with LYSA-302. Lysogene's clinical development program includes 4 different studies. The P1 study, which was a phase 1-2 clinical trial that enrolled 4 patients treated with our first generation vector, LYSA-301. This study was completed several years ago and was a safety tolerability study. The P3 natural history study, a prospective natural history study in 23 subjects with MPS IIIA. This is the study that is used as a control group in our gene therapy trial A events. The results of this study were published this year. The A event study, which is our phase 2-3 clinical trial with the second generation product, LYSA-302. We just obtained 2-year data from this study, and I'm going to present you the preliminary data shortly. And finally, the PROVIDE study, which is a video outcome study that runs in parallel to the A event study, and that is a study that looks at novel exploratory outcomes and is completed has been completed with a 2-year readout. Our phase 2-3 trial A events enrolled 19 patients between 10 and 64 months of age at enrollment. And the gene therapy vector LYSA-302 was administered by intraparenchymal or intracerebral injection at a dose of 7.2 times 10 to the 12 viral genomes. The inclusion criteria were a DQ or developmental quotient equal to or greater than 50%. The DQ is the ratio between developmental age as measured by the Bailey Scale of Intellectual Development, 3rd edition or BSID, and the chronological age. And the second inclusion criteria is an age greater than 6 months. Primary endpoint is the change in DQ at 24 months, and the comparator arm is a natural history cohort with the same inclusion criteria. Secondary endpoints are behavior, quality of life, imaging biomarkers, fluid biomarkers, and safety tolerability. And the efficacy assessment, we will look at both primary, secondary, and exploratory endpoints, as well as the results of the PROVIDE video study, which ran in parallel in the same patient cohort. I'm going to start by summarizing the preliminary safety profile of LYSA-302 in the ADVANCE trial. So in this trial, we saw T2 hyperintensities by MRI within the cerebral white matter around injection trajectories. These white matter MRI abnormalities tend to stabilize or decrease in intensity from 12 months onwards. And most importantly, no clinically significant symptoms were observed that could be directly attributed to these findings. Other AEs were really compatible with the disease course, so typical of MPS IIIA, including GI disturbances and respiratory infections. There were no clinically significant lab findings. And as you probably know, very sadly, one patient aged 5 years passed away 18 months after drug administration. According to expert opinion, the combined effects of unplanned concurrently administered palliative drugs with sedative effects are a potential causative factor in the patient's decline and a possible precipitant of death. It should also be said that although they are rare, early fatal outcomes have been reported in MPS IIIA, particularly specifically at that age. And finally, again, according to expert opinion, there was no evidence to implicate the gene therapy procedure as a causative factor in the patient's decline and death. We obtained positive results with a disease biomarker heparan sulfate that confirmed the biological activity of LYSA-302. We are measuring heparan sulfate in the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF as well as in the serum. Now, the source of heparan sulfate in the CSF is not known. However, it can be assumed that it comes from at least 3 different sources: the brain parenchyma, the spinal cord, and the choroid plexus. It is possible that small heparan sulfate-derived oligosaccharides could enter the CSF also from the bloodstream. Now, Lysogene, since it is administered directly into the brain, will not leak out of the brain and will lead to a reduction of heparan sulfate only in that organ. And therefore, it can be expected that Lysogene will be able to reduce heparan sulfate coming into the CSF from the brain parenchyma, but not the heparan sulfate that comes into the CSF from other sources, such as the spinal cord or choroid plexus. And in fact, we do see a statistically significant reduction of heparan sulfate in the CSF at 6, 12, and 24 months after drug administration. The reduction is about 20%. We believe this is the part of heparan sulfate that comes from the brain parenchyma into the CSF. We see no reduction of heparan sulfate in the serum. And the CNS-specific reduction of heparan sulfate is consistent with the intracerebral mode of drug administration. We also measured serum levels of neurofilament light, which is a biomarker of neuronal damage. And on the graph here, you can see baseline levels, which are represented by the dashed line, as well as neurofilament light levels in the serum at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months after treatment. And there are 3 things that should be noted on this graph. So first of all, the baseline levels are higher than the normal reference range. They are above 100 picogram per ml. The normal range in healthy subjects being less than 10 picogram per ml. And this likely reflects ongoing neurodegeneration in MPS IIIA. It should be noted that a similar range has been observed in other pediatric lysosomal storage diseases. The second point is that there is an increase of neurofilament light in the serum at 6 months following treatment, and this may reflect transient axonal damage induced by brain surgery and/or by the white matter lesions. Interestingly, a similar transient increase has been reported following placement of ICV catheters in other clinical trials. So it's likely that this increase is caused by the brain surgery. And the third point is that there is a decrease of NFL below baseline levels at 18 months and 24 months after treatment. This is highly statistically significant, decreases of 33% at 18 months and 41% at 24 months. And we believe that this decrease may indicate a positive response to Lysogene treatment. Similar results were observed for neurofilament light in the cerebrospinal fluid and with a transient increase followed by a decrease below baseline levels at 24 months, again a 33% decrease below baseline levels. So this confirms positive response to treatment. Here we see the evolution of cognitive age, that is developmental age as measured by the BSID, for all patients in the trial, so 19 patients. The treated subjects are the colored lines here, while the natural history patients are the gray lines below. And as you can appreciate, this is a complex picture that will need to be analyzed statistically. Statistical analysis is ongoing, and we will have final data. We expect final data in the third quarter this year. If we take a closer look, we can see there is a subgroup of patients with encouraging cognitive development, about half of the subjects. These subjects, which include all of the patients treated at 31 months or less, have increasing, stable, or slowly declining developmental age with time. This figure shows the evolution of cognitive DA in 2 natural history studies in children with MPS IIIA, our own natural history study and the natural history study by Shapiro and co-workers. And you see the typical bell-shaped curve here with an increasing DA that plateaus between about 30 and 50 months, followed by a decline. And one interesting thing to note here is that the maximum DA that was observed in these two natural history studies, as well as in other natural history studies that are in the literature, is 35. So no patient here has a DA above 35. What we observe in the A-events trial is that all subjects treated at 30 months or less of age, there are 6 patients in that subgroup, have either increasing or stable DA. So the data from this younger patient cohort show a persistent increase or stabilization in the main cognitive, language, and motor domains over a period of at least 24 months post-treatment. Now, what is also important to note is that there are 2 patients that have a cognitive DA, these 2 patients here, a cognitive DA at 24 months after treatment that is above the highest value seen in the natural history cohort, the value of 35 that I just mentioned before. These 2 patients have exceeded that DA by 5 and 6 months respectively. They reached a DA of 41 and 42. If we look at the SGSH mutations in the 6 youngest subjects, we can see that 4 of them have mutations associated with the classical severe disease phenotype. 1 patient has a severe mutation in 1 allele and a mutation with unknown effect on disease severity on the 2nd allele, and 1 patient is a compound heterozygote for a severe mutation and a S298P mutation, which may give rise to either to a classical severe or an intermediate phenotype. So this last patient, for this last patient, longer follow-up is warranted to confirm positive evolution of development in that patient. However, what is really striking is that the 2 patients with the highest DA have biallelic deletions or duplications in SGSH. That is, they express no functional enzyme. And this really strongly suggests that early treatment can protect children with MPS IIIA from decline of cognition, language, and motor development. So in summary, 19 children with MPS IIIA were treated with intraparenchymally administered LYSA-302 in the A-events trial. Database was locked last week, and the results are going to be available in September. Preliminary data show encouraging development of cognitive, motor, and language domains of the BSID in patients treated at 31 months or less, with a continuously increasing or stable DA, which suggests that younger patients are more responsive to treatment. This will need to be corroborated by data from the final analysis. The biomarker data support a positive treatment response to LYSA-302, and white matter abnormalities near injection sites stabilized or improved from 12 months onwards and have no apparent clinically significant consequences. And finally, the efficacy analysis will be complemented by results of the ancillary PROVIDE video study. And with that, I would like to thank the principal investigators and clinical sites, all our neurosurgeons, my colleagues at Lysogene, and of course, the patients driving research, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you for both of those wonderful presentations. Really some interesting new data that's being shared there. Anyone who has questions for the Lysogene team, feel free to send them through and we can accumulate them, or feel free to reach out to the team yourselves. But we do have Dr. Polgreen here, and we do have questions for you. So
right.
Here we go. Let's see. Maybe the first will be, there's a comment about the youngest patient enrolled was 6 years old, and kind of a question of why were younger patients not enrolled?
Yeah, this was, as I can see Cara smiling, she knows we had a lot of discussions about this one. We had a restriction put on us by the FDA early on of not enrolling anyone younger than 4. And really the motivation behind that was that they did not want us competing with enzyme restorative trials. So this was the first study of this approach in Sanfilippo. We didn't expect it to be a cure, and so for that reason, we didn't want the FDA did not want families to who could go in a enzyme restorative approach to come into this trial. So it really was aimed at kids with more advanced disease who did not have the option to go into those other enzyme or gene therapy studies. And so that was really in there by design. I would like to just make one quick comment, Cara. I realized I had a typo on an early slide that of the dose, which kind of tripped me up. And I just want to clarify the dose we're using is 100 milligrams, not micrograms. I'd written micrograms on the slide. So it's 100 milligrams and then increasing to 200 milligrams at week 16.
Okay, thank you.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. Are you able to comment on what proportion of patients so far needed to take that step up in dose?
Yeah, I think it's around 75% of the patients did. And so when we're looking forward to the next study, we are going to go forward with the 200 milligram dose. And the two, the 2 shots each day have been tolerable to families. We check in with them on that very often. It's not ideal, but it just doesn't come in any other format other than a 100 milligram single use injection. And so it will need to be used as 2 daily injections, but they're given at the same time. So it's not that you have to go through the whole procedure twice a day. It's just once a day.
Gotcha. Okay. And has there been any analysis or insight at this point as to which patients may need dose escalation or which patients don't? Are there characteristics obvious at this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't looked at it yet. It's something we'll need to look at, but we just haven't done it yet.
Great. Okay. And then here's a question. Is there a pattern to the response in terms of severity of symptoms? I may not be understanding the question correctly, so forgive me to the person asking the question if I'm not getting it. Yeah. Okay. Then there are some questions kind of roughly around, what would it take to, have broader access to this and, FDA approval for such an indication? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so this study was not designed to seek FDA approval for anakinra in MPS III and Sanfilippo syndrome because it's the first one and there was no placebo. And so to move forward, because the results do look so encouraging, we have been in discussions with SOBI about what the phase 3 trial might look like, what their involvement might be. And once we sort that out, then we need to start the discussions with the FDA on what might outcome be that they would be okay with being our primary outcome. And I think there's one question here about the FDA agreeing that the outcomes we were looking at could be used for approval, and no, they have not. We discussed the trial with them. They helped us in adjusting the protocol some, but it was clear from the beginning, and there was never a discussion with them about what would the outcome need to be to seek approval. And they did make it clear at that time, which this was, I guess, maybe 3 years ago, that at that point using the MDRI as a primary outcome was not something that they could get on board with yet. So hopefully, my hope is that changes over time. I know there's other people working on that too, because I do think it's a really good way to look at these diseases that are so heterogeneous. And so hopefully that will change. But for now, they did not approve. They did not say that the outcomes we were using could be use to seek approval.
Yeah. And absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes taking that first step and trying out these new things, and then you find out if it works, and then there's kind of a new view of how how maybe regulatory or the broader scientific community kind of comes to understand its relevance. So, some of this is we step out and we take educated path about what might be best, and in the interest of time for these patients, just move forward.
Yeah, exactly. And the hope is we can just get it tested as soon as possible to get an answer of does it work or not. But because there are all sorts of different things that come up when you actually seek to get an indication, and that's something we would, I think, need the support of SOBI to do.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let me scroll down, make sure there's not something else. I think that is it. What a great session. Thank you so much for being here.
So happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, take care. Bye.
Welcome back, everyone, to our last session of Advanced 2022. This session is titled Parenting Siblings of Children with Sanfilippo. And as a parent, I am really excited for this session. It's an incredible group of people that are so insightful. We have facilitating this session Dr. Kenneth Phelps, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Prisma Health and the University of South Carolina. And he will be talking with two incredible young adults who you will just be so inspired by. So I'll let you take it from here, Dr. Phelps.
Thanks, Cara. Appreciate that. Truer words haven't been spoken. I'm really excited for this session, and I'm so grateful to be here with you. I've enjoyed so many of the sessions here at the conference, and unfortunately, one of my children was under the weather yesterday, but it allowed me to be at home and see many more of the sessions than I would have otherwise. So I think it's been so nice to see a balance of research and also personal experience. And the slide directly before this one that talked about connecting with others and showed so many of those beautiful faces of your children was so inspiring. So I'm really honored to conclude this conference, and I really think, as Cara said, you're in for a treat. In a moment, you'll hear from two remarkable people. I've been really impressed with everything I've read and heard from them. I've been able to listen to a podcast and look at some websites and things, and really my hopes for today's session is to have some time to hear the stories of two siblings of a young person who's lived with Sanfilippo, Noah Siedman, as well as Gray Chapin. Beyond some of their personal experiences as a sibling, we're really planning to ask Noah and Gray to talk some about what their parents did that felt really helpful and useful through the years, as well as anything that they might have wished that could have been a bit different. And I think any of our children would probably say there are things we could be doing different. And so I want to mention out the gate here that I think our tendency as parents is to, at least for folks I see in clinical practice, and I work with a lot of families that are dealing with illness and disability, is to just should ourselves, what we should have done differently, or how we shouldn't have lost our temper, or how we should have handled a situation better. And I think truly there is no manual for parenting. It might be more accurate to say there are hundreds, if not thousands, of manuals that folks like myself have attempted to write. But just the fact that there are hundreds or thousands of manuals go to tell you that there's no easy solutions in the world of parenting. But I hope you're able to take away some tidbits, and I have no doubt that you will from the folks we're going to hear from. But as you listen, I ask that you really listen with a compassionate ear for yourself, and know that no one is doing this parent thing perfectly. And we all wish we could kind of go back and change some things in what we've done as parents, but it's important to treat ourselves with kindness and care through the process. So as we get started, I will invite you to please put your questions or comments as you have all conference in that section. We're actually going to speak together as a group until about 4:20. And then from 4:20 to 4:30, in and around those time periods, we're going to open it up for some questions. And I'm going to take your questions for Noah as well as for Gray. So without further ado, I'd like to, if we could bring into the session Gray. Gray?
Hello.
And Noah. Hey, Noah.
How's it going?
I'm good. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Good.
Not too bad.
Well, I would love to start out with, if you could just share a bit about yourselves, where are you in the world and kind of what's going on in your lives. And then maybe if you could just go ahead and share a bit about your sibling who lived with Sanfilippo. I think the group would love to hear about yourselves and your relationship. And so, Gray, do you want to go first? Is that okay?
Sure. So I'm from Orlando. I just graduated high school a couple months ago, and I'm heading to the University of Florida in August. So I'm excited. My Sanfilippo connection, my sister Blair, had Sanfilippo and passed away in 2017. So it's been about 5 years. She was diagnosed when she was 6 and I was 4. And most of my time with her, like Noah, I spent fundraising and advocating, and I'm still pretty involved with the Sanfilippo community today.
Awesome. Congratulations on going to Florida.
Thank you.
Do you know what you're going for?
Public relations is the plan, but we'll see.
Maybe all the experience you had with raising awareness will come in handy.
Yes.
Sure.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. I appreciate that. What about you, Noah?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, my name is Noah Siedman. I am the older brother of Ben, who had MPS 3B, so Sanfilippo. And yeah, let's see. Man, college is a scary landmark. I am 5 years out. Currently, yeah, right, doing a little vacationing in Chicago and hanging out in a friend's room. So I'm hoping that I have no Wi-Fi stutters or anything like that.
You sounded good so far.
Yeah, glad to hear it. Let's see. I would say, Gray hit the nail on the head. Did a lot of advocacy. Spent a little bit less time, I think, remaining involved since my brother's death. I focused a little bit more on the grief side of things and trying to work my way through how to talk about that with parents and siblings and my peers in a way that lets people sort of engage with it on terms that they can digest, as opposed to sort of just getting the whole totality of it at once,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I find with folks I talk with, no, I don't know if this is what you mean. It's hard to even put into words or articulate because it is such a large experience and that encompasses so many years. Yeah. Yeah. So, could you guys just share a bit with the group about what your relationship was like with your sibling over the years? I mean, I think, we would love to hear a bit about just over the years how things progressed and how your relationship changed as time passed.
I can go. So my relationship with Blair was very playful, I'd say. I was the little sister, so we tried to keep that even as Sanfilippo progressed. Just my role, even as it shifted a little bit more to the caregiver, that I always kept that sibling connection and tossing the ball with her and doing just as much as we could as it progressed, adapting, and always keeping that just kind of sister gossip and even if it's one-sided. So yes, I would definitely say playful throughout the whole time. And even as it progressed and I became more of the big sister role, I think that all stayed the same.
Yeah, the playfulness remained even when you were, yeah.
Even as I grew up, always like that. I was always, my job was always to make her laugh, and I think that was important.
Yeah, yeah. How do you think you retained some of the playfulness even while it sounds like you moved from that younger sister to an older sister role, or more of a caretaker role?
I mean, I think it was really her that kept that going for us, because she was always very a lot of laughter and very playful. So I don't even think it was me. I didn't have to do anything to keep that going. I think it was all her.
Yeah. That's great. What about you, Noah? How did things sort of change over time? And
yeah, I think similarly, there was definitely a transition from feeling like you were siblings to moving into somewhat more of a caretaker role. And maybe for me, more pronounced because I was already the older brother. So I think that was in the cards no matter what was going to happen. I mean, you could ask my little sister, and I imagine she feels that I handled things similarly. But the thing about Gray's point that really struck me is you kind of were always chasing the next smile. It was like, okay, yesterday morning, here's what made my brother, here's what made my sister laugh. What's it going to be today? And how can I find that? And how can we enjoy that together? And so I think that was a really good way to sort of identify how the relationship changed. When my brother was younger, and I imagine when Blair was younger as well, it was easier to have a more nuanced thing that got to the smile. Maybe it was, playing baseball together or gossiping or whatever activity the two of you enjoyed. And it felt in excuse me, it felt in some ways like you were sort of seeking the next thing and having to make some allowances, paring it down a little bit. Okay, maybe something like baseball wasn't really in the cards anymore, and so now it was just throwing the ball, or watching the ball be thrown, or zipping around in a wheelchair and going up on two wheels. It really, like, it was sort of whatever you could find, and I think that part was the most consistent bit, right? Like, no matter what the medium to get to the smile was, that was always the goal.
Yeah. Noah, would you mind? I listened to the podcast you did before, and when you talked about going around on two wheels, it reminded, where I'm going. It reminded me.
Yeah. You want the supermarket story?
Can you tell the story? I love the story of the supermarket.
Yeah. Okay, so Ben, towards the end of his life, was in a wheelchair, but his wheelchair was more of like an all-terrain stroller. This like massive construction with huge wheels, and it was very stable. And so what we would do is Ben, myself, and my mom would go to the supermarket, and we'd get in the door, and my mom would like peel off to the produce, and she would say, "Ben, no, I get bread." Just like completely inefficient. And we would pelt through the supermarket, me running as fast as I could. We'd like take the corners on one wheel, we'd bounce off displays, and we'd come back with the bread, and she'd be like, "All right, go get milk." And so we'd drop off the bread and we'd go do it again. And the whole time Ben is just like cackling like a madman. And I'm sitting there thinking, yes, I'm going to get away with it. No one can yell at us. And it was true. We terrorized that Star Market, but it made Ben so happy. And so it was the perfect activity.
Yeah. I just imagine all the other shoppers looking around like, what in the world is going on here? Yeah.
Yep. And after all the years of like feeling a little uncomfortable going out to restaurants or in public spaces and having to explain your siblings' behavior, it was kind of nice to be cloaked by it in some ways, because the two of us, we literally took it as a free pass to be hooligans in a supermarket. Like, should we have done that? No. Did we get away with it? Absolutely. And so there was a little bit of like subversive joy in just getting to wreck the place and not have to deal with the consequences.
Absolutely. Do you all find that at times it was hard to live? Like, that story strikes me because it feels like it's so in the present moment. You're just in the supermarket going around corners. Did you find that it was hard to live in the here and the now, the present moment, or was it not too difficult to do that? Or is it depends kind of answer, I wonder?
I think it was super hard. I think that was probably the majority of the journey that I went on throughout Ben's life, was coming to the conclusion that living in the moment was the thing to do, and then actually executing on that. I think especially when you know about the diagnosis and what that means from such an early age, you start thinking about the future so quickly, right? I was 4 when I learned about Ben's diagnosis, and I think I was at the end of my driveway selling lemonade to raise money a couple of days later. And so that's not living in the moment, right? That's almost the opposite. And so it took a long time for me to go from like, I'm going to raise money and we're going to fix this, to I'm going to make people aware about this and it's going to be better for Ben and people like him, to I'm going to be there for my brother for its own purpose. And I think that journey really clashed a little bit with my inherent, like, I want to solve this. I want to treat it as a problem. And it's hard to get away from. I imagine it's also really hard to get away from as a parent.
Yeah, for sure. What about you, Gray? What was it challenging to live in the now?
I totally agree. I feel like fundraising was such a big part of our like it kind of is living in the now, but it's also not. Like, it gives you that kind of glimpse of hope and feel like you're doing something to make a change, but also like it makes you think more about the future, and then just your whole idea of why you're fundraising and why you're like what you're spending your time doing changing to like from I'm trying to find a cure for my sister, and then more it might be too late for her, now we're working towards a cure for others. And I think that we always did a pretty good job of living in the moment. I was also 4 when Blair was diagnosed, so that was just always kind of a part of my life, that it wasn't like there was some big shift in my life of like Blair's going to be in my life forever and now she's not. So I guess that helped me in a way of living in the moment, because there was never a big change, and we always just kind of had that in the back of our mind. But I think it's good for most of the time to keep it there and more focus on just adventures and having fun and making her laugh.
Yeah, yeah. So, if we shift a little bit of thinking about parenting and your parents, what do you think that you needed most as a sibling of someone living with Sanfilippo, and what stands out that you think your parents did that felt really helpful or useful, or any feedback you have around just thinking about parenting and being a sibling? Great.
I think that like a balance of honesty and like support is really important. I wouldn't try to necessarily shield your like unaffected child from everything going on, because we're smart. We know what's happening. We know when you're hiding something from us. And I think it's more important to be honest and then see, okay, how are they handling that? I don't think they can handle this. Let's not share this with them.
Mm-hmm.
More so honest conversations, honesty about your own emotions as a parent, and like sharing, we're scared too, we're confused, we don't know what life's going to be like in a few months or whatever it may be. And then just making sure to check in on the sibling, and not too much, but enough that they know that you're there for them and that you are just choosing your actions carefully and know that they're mature, but that you're also looking out for them.
Yeah, yeah. So I loved in what you said, kind of modeling when it's hard to talk about it's hard. I wonder if you guys have thoughts to follow up on something you said of how parents could tell when they're checking up the right amount versus when it's too much, because I think that's a nuanced thing as a parent, is like, I want to make sure Noah or Gray or whomever is okay, but I also don't want to be like giving them too much or too little attention. I mean, I think the attentional discrepancy is felt in many families, I would assume. So I don't know if anything else springs from that.
Yeah, I think the idea that I've been trying to push is like shooting for a normal amount of attention or an equitable amount of attention, or checking up enough is sort of a weird void to shout into, and that it's not going to be super helpful. I think really the like crux of this is remembering that advocacy is a super portable skill, and that all of this work that you've done advocating for your child with Sanfilippo is also something that they've picked up and learned and need to be shown that they can use it to advocate for themselves. Like, it's something that we all of us siblings have become really good at, is knowing when to say, hey, I need this. Like, I recognize how important everything else that's going on is, and I also have a need. And so I think that a lot, like Gray was saying, including the unaffected siblings in those conversations, if not the decision-making process right from the get-go, is a really good way to help them contextualize what's going on, and also encourage them to speak up and say, hey, it's time for me to have some time, or whatever that is. And your kids, when it's time to check up and make sure they're not getting into something or struggling in math too much. And when it's time to sit down and have the family conversation about like, okay, here are the next steps in Ben's life, in Blair's life. What do you think that looks like for you? What does that feel like for you? And so, don't pick a marker in the sand and say, okay, this is normal. This is what we're going to go for. Help your child articulate what they want as normal, or as sufficient, or as supported, and then work towards that together.
So almost like rather than being like, this is what as a parent I feel like a 12-year-old normal should feel like,
right.
Let me sit down and talk with my 12-year-old and say, like, I know life is really challenging and feels different than a lot of your friends might. What is it that we can do to be helpful, or how can we, kind of tailor it to what they need? Is that what
right? Right. Like, don't look around at other parents and say, okay, Ryan's parents have come to almost every one of his soccer games this season. That must be normal. That's what I should do. I think you sit down and you say, hey, Noah, a lot of parents are going to every soccer game. That is a lot of the time that we would be able to spend just focusing on you. Is that how you want us to spend it? Is that what you need? And I know that in some ways that's going to feel bad because you're asking your child to prioritize. But I also think that it will lead to a healthier solution. It is in some ways the reality of our lives. Like, trust me when I say, like, Gray and I, knowing about this from 4, know how to prioritize. We understand when it's, we've come back from a hard day and our sibling is in that sort of manic phase, and it's time to just say, okay, I'm gonna push this aside. I'm gonna take a minute and try to handle it myself, or table it until there's a moment when it's a little bit more, reasonable to address this. And so the more you include us in that, how you're prioritizing, the better we can find that balance together, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, guys, I know we were going to switch over in about 5 or 6 minutes, but I see lots of questions coming in. So would you guys be okay if we pivoted over to some of the group's questions? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to start here at the top because I want to make sure that we get to as many attendee questions as we can. So some of the initial questions I'm seeing is like, what is an age-appropriate discussion about the progression and life expectancy? So I wonder if you guys could share a bit about when your parents would have had those conversations. Or I think for my role as a healthcare practitioner, I think there's a lot of like, what's developmentally appropriate in this, and are we talking to a 5-year-old or an 18-year-old? But I wonder if you could share a bit about how your parents had those types of conversations about end of life topics and progression, things like that.
I mean, in terms of diagnosis conversations and like progression, I don't remember many of those because, like I said, I was 4 when Blair was diagnosed. And I don't remember that many conversations throughout her life about like, this is what we expect. I feel like I just always knew, and it was day by day what was happening and what the doctor said and all of that. But in terms of, I think that our biggest conversation that we had as a family was a few weeks before Blair passed away. And I was 13. So at that point, I felt like I could handle all of that. And I think that my parents felt that way too. But also it's one of those things that you have to clue your child on, even if they aren't 13, even if they're younger, because it's just such a big thing that you kind of need to let them in on that so that they can really start appreciating their time with their sibling more. That conversation was, you've seen how Blair's doing, and the doctors say that, we only have a few weeks left. And that was like my parents and I, like, we cried together, we discussed it together. That was really when they shared their emotions about it all, which I think is like a super important part of it. Like, they don't know they've never been through this either.
Mm-hmm.
So we were all just kind of going through it together. And then kind of just giving your child freedom to do what they want. If you want to sleep with your sibling now for the next few weeks, like, do it, like, whatever you need. But again, we keep talking about how like mature even younger siblings are. I don't think that like keeping anything from them at that point is very healthy. I think that they've handled it and they are going to handle it. And again, just like being honest and then supporting afterwards, I think is the most important part.
Yeah. What strikes me about what you said, Gray, over the years it wasn't like one 100-minute conversation, but it was like 1 million like little 1-minute conversations that you were involved as much as was developmentally appropriate, just in kind of like the conversation of the family, even though obviously there were some things they likely guarded you from. But yeah. Okay. What about you, Noah? Thoughts again?
Yeah. I guess I can remember from a really early age the phrase incurable and untreatable. And so I think I put together what that meant if it wasn't explicitly said to me. But I would say the part about how my parents had this kind of conversation with me over time was that it never felt like they had to walk anything back. There was never a moment where they were like, oh, we didn't tell you that this was going to happen. And so I would say that's a really good model to pick, is decide how much you'd like to explain to your child, and do it in such a way that you have room to add to it and room to go into maybe more detail or be more explicit or involve them in some of the more, smaller decision points. But don't put yourself in a position where you're going to have to walk it back and say, well, actually, this is what's going to happen. Obviously, there's some amount of unknown, but you don't have to start your conversation with your young unaffected sibling about feeding tubes and spinal fusion. You can sort of paint in very broad strokes and speak with a professional like Dr. Phelps about the best way to bring about the concept of mortality and death to a young child, and fill in the details as you go on, as they age and as they can engage with that better.
Yeah. And I get the image almost of like a funnel. You may start broad, and over time, as young people ask questions, or as it seems, you kind of get a little bit more specific. But if you give misinformation to try to protect a young person, then I think that can affect some mistrust of like, wait a minute, I thought this was what it was. And I think that can lead to some hesitancy of,
and don't be afraid to use answers like, I don't know the answer yet, or I'm not ready to talk about this yet. Like, those are not hard things to hear as a kid, and I think it feels like they are it feels like they're hard things to say as a parent.
Yeah, or I love that, like daddy doesn't exactly know how to answer that question, but I need to talk with the doctors and figure out what's the best way to answer that question. But it's a really good question for me to, look into. Definitely.
Because it doesn't end the conversation. It doesn't discourage me from asking more. And it actually, I think, feels more inclusive than I think almost any other answer. Okay,
great. Yeah. Any tips to support siblings emotionally? For instance, if siblings are feeling, I don't know if you guys ever had this feeling, but jealousy, I'm sure that never happened, right? But jealousy and stretched attention from parents, that's that attention kind of differential. Is there anything your parents did over the years, or you would think would be really helpful in supporting you emotionally in that kind of situation?
I do remember feeling jealous. I remember specifically that right after his diagnosis, Ben got to stay up past 8:30 and watch TV with my parents. And I remember being really pissed about that. I remember coming down and like creeping down the stairs of our ancient house so slowly so as not to make a creak, and sitting just around the corner to like catch the glow of what was going on in the living room. And I can't remember how long it was until I got caught, but eventually I got caught and had to explain why I was doing it. And then it was another one of those conversations where like, Ben's not feeling well and he doesn't understand what's going on. And sometimes we need to make allowances for that. And I think even, 4 or 5-year-old me was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, I just think that, just conversations like that are really important. I think that all like unaffected siblings probably feel jealousy like that at some point. I remember it really fading away as I got older and started to understand everything more. And just knowing that the attention that you give, just like any siblings, like it's just different. So even though they might be giving this many hours to Blair for this, like they're spending this time with me doing something else. And I think that at some point your sibling just understands after a certain amount of time and conversations.
Yeah, that's well put. I think, when kids are younger developmentally, they're often very preoccupied by things like fairness and equality and what feels right. I have a few kids, and the one who's in that phase will constantly say it's not fair. And so I think that as we get more complex ability to think through things cognitively, we're able to kind of think through that in bigger ways. I think that's well put. So some folks said, I would love to hear some stories of times when siblings did really something special. It could relate to Sanfilippo or totally independent. I'm looking for encouraging words on parenting. Sort of like, it sounds like when you, like a special moment of connection or something special you did as it pertains to Sanfilippo, maybe, or something totally separate, like advocacy wise or something like that, maybe.
I guess I would say treat it on its own merits in the context of your lives. I think that it always kind of stuck a little bit in my throat when I would get all of this praise for doing something that felt normal. Like when you grow up like Gray and I did, and your parents are speaking at events and raising money and doing all of this stuff, mirroring that isn't, I mean, it's good and it is praiseworthy, but it's not so special that I felt like I needed to get like shoved up on a podium, because it was what my parents did and because it was what I wanted to do for my brother. And so I think remembering to contextualize based on your child's experience when you dole out that praise and when you look at those achievements is a really good way to make sure that you and your child are on the same page, right? You want to really praise the thing that your kid feels the best about, and that might not be, you know, writing the letter to Roach Brothers to get water for your fundraiser. It might be, you know, auditioning for a play or doing well on a math test or whatever the heck it is. You got to figure out what that thing is for them, and that's the thing that you want to really lift them up about. And sometimes that means treating things that are really abnormal to other families or maybe to your experience growing up as somewhat normal, like caring for your sibling for an entire day. That was just what we did. And so being praised for it in some ways felt disingenuous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Go ahead, Greg. Go ahead.
No, I wasn't going to add anything. I was just going to say, I agree.
Ditto.
Mhm.
I think praise is so vital in families, but I think we don't give young people enough credit how they can tell when it's from a very genuine, value-driven place versus when it's kind of a disingenuous, I know I'm supposed to praise. I think that it's pretty important. So there's a couple questions in here about like, what does appropriate mental health care look like? Is there research that shows that children who, you know, have siblings who are living with a terminal illness are much more likely to experience long-term mental health struggles? I can say that the bulk of the work that I do is working with family members and siblings who have a family member who's living with a chronic or terminal illness, and that I'm not aware of any research to that liking. In fact, my research is on things like resilience and growth and enrichment, and much of the research that I've done and I'm aware of says that yes, there is a heightened level of stress, and understandably a heightened level sometimes for depression and anxiety. But in research, people have actually started giving measures to look at strengths, which, you know, you can imagine in psychology we didn't do for a while. But when you look at that, there are equivalent increases above and beyond other populations of things like growth and satisfaction with life and feeling like I understand what really matters in life, and I understand how important and precious life is, and I feel really connected to the present moment in ways I would have never had if I hadn't had a sibling with Sanfilippo. So that's what the research says, but I'm actually much more interested if that's your lived experience or if it's not been that, you know, at all for you guys.
I think that sounds pretty accurate. Appreciating life more, stronger relationships, more empathy, patience, like everything that we learned as a sibling, like we're taking with us for the rest of our lives, and it's making us better people and stronger people that can handle more, even if there's that lingering grief or whatever it is. Like we can handle it.
Yeah, I mean, I could put a really simple, concrete thing is that like pretty much everyone should have some amount of therapy. I would say you would not be remiss to just say, yeah, let's all go find a therapist, whether it's as a family or as individuals. You know, it's never going to lead you astray. So that would be my recommendation. I have a therapist. It is immensely helpful, both in dealing with the normal crap that comes up in your life and, you know, the world today, unpacking some of the stuff that I went through as a sibling and everything in between. Yeah, go find a therapist for your children, find a therapist for yourself. I can't imagine anybody in this chat room is going to disagree with me on that one.
Yeah, I think I sometimes say finding a good therapist or one that fits for you is like finding a good pair of running shoes. You know, if anybody's a runner, you go out and sometimes they give you blisters or shin splints the first time or two, but then you settle on somebody who feels like they understand and is a good fit. And it should be a good mental health care. I think it feels like a safe place where you feel like you're not having judgment, but you're having somebody who can walk alongside you, who's not trying to fix things, but who's trying to help you think through the best way to approach things in your life and understand kind of where you're at and where you want to go in the future. So I appreciate the endorsement for therapy, Noah. Yeah. So how can I help my my unaffected child deal with aggression from the child with Sanfilippo? So if there's hitting or aggression happening in the home, any ideas on that?
Can you wait? Aggression from the child with Sanfilippo towards the unaffected?
Towards
yeah,
the sibling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's tough, right? Obviously, there are different expectations of the child with Sanfilippo. Like sitting them down and having a timeout might have dubious effectiveness based on how old they are and where they are in their progression. So I would imagine that, like we've been saying all evening, you know, communicate. Tell your unaffected child that this is unacceptable behavior. Offer them, you know, some options. Say, I can sit down and talk with Ben if he hits you. We can put him aside and he can watch TV in the yellow room for an hour. You know, you can go away and have your computer time. You can go do X, Y, or Z. Which one is going to feel the best? Because I can't always stop it, and he doesn't quite understand in the same way. And so make them part of that solution and that decision making. And hopefully it will feel better that there seems to be like unequal consequences for that behavior out of you and out of your sibling.
Yeah, I agree. I think communication is really important. And when all of that first starts, like just making sure that your child feels safe, not just letting it happen, but also, I think that over time, like I started to understand why Blair was hitting me and how to handle it myself without my parents stepping in, even though she was much stronger than me. You learn either to just back out and take some time or, you know, give her a hug, whatever it is, or the opposite. But I think that, again, it's just time and communication that really would help a sibling deal with that, but also, yeah, like Noah said, different strategies just to make them feel supported and safe.
Yeah. So maybe one more question we could jump through, if that's okay, guys. I would love to hear thoughts on whether, when, or how to share their, meaning the siblings, carrier status, positive or negative, with them, assuming the parent knows, but the child does not know yet.
That's another thing that I don't remember having a conversation with my parents about, but I just knew. But also, I mean, that's not something that's super alarming to me because I know that I'll get tested and my spouse will get tested, and it will hopefully, like, you know, with technology and just knowing what you're in for. But it's definitely important to communicate that at some point. I don't remember when that was communicated to me, but it wasn't made to be a big deal. It was just another part of the whole journey.
Yeah.
I would echo that. I think that I certainly remember knowing for most of my life, and I remember it having different meanings and being a different piece of conversations as I grew up. Like when you're 4 and you hear about that, it's kind of the, you know, the last detail that you'd ever remember. And it's not really until you start to hit the point in your life where you're really planning for your future and thinking about what things are going to look like that you start to say, okay, what does this mean for me? How does genetic testing align with my values? How does communication with partners align with my values around this? And those are harder conversations to have probably, but they also will come much later. I don't think your 7 or 8 year old is like, oh crap, when I get married, I'm going to have to talk to my partner about this and get tested. And like, that's just not the reality. And I think that the earlier the more time you have to sort of like kick the can around in your head and figure out where you land on all of these things, because they are super complex and super personal. And I don't regret at all having known about it for as long as I did and having been able to think about it as much as I did.
Yeah, I can just speak anecdotally in the families I've worked with. I have not seen anyone anecdotally frustrated that they learned early on. It's just felt like what you guys say, it's part of the conversation, it's something I knew. I have, however, seen folks frustrated that they were not told until quite a bit later. So if that makes a difference for folks, and some clinically what I've seen with not just Sanfilippo, but other conditions that would involve genetic testing and things.
I think one of the common threads for us as siblings is that we learn really early on that our decisions matter. And so we value super highly more information and more understanding of what's going to happen when we do make a choice. And so, yeah, not having what feels like a crucial piece of the puzzle as you transition into being an adult is certainly a source of resentment. So yeah, more information, better. It's better to like have it out there and then help your child handle it than it is to keep it from them and drop it on them later when you feel like they might be more ready. I think more ready is kind of a bit of a fallacy.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. So we could sit here for another 5 hours. So you guys are so enjoyable to interact with. I wanted to conclude in doing some background work. I felt like I was stalking you guys online a little bit. I was looking at Gray's website, and I was listening to the podcast of Noah. But I love on the website, I know that you had before, Gray, and you update to some degree now, that it's called the Blair Connection. And I love that Blair stands for brave, loving, amazing, inspiring, and relentless. Did I get it right?
Good. Yeah, you got it.
Which is, I think, truer words could not be spoken about many of the children living with Sanfilippo, but also you have on your website about the siblings, and I would also say the parents as well. So thank you guys so much. Any concluding comments, anything you want to say before we end? It's been such a pleasure talking to you guys.
I don't think so. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
All right.
Oh,
You're muted, Glenn. We can't hear you. You look like you're saying good things, though.
Just wanted to say thank you all for the time, too. We appreciate Dr. Phelps. Thank you, Noah and Gray.
Thank you, guys.
thanks.
Well, what a quite a powerful and emotional final session to wrap up Advanced 2022 Sanfilippo. I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank the presenters, the panelists, and all our partner sponsors. What a full 2 days it's been, filled with some incredible information, learning, science, and hopefully resources. I hope you all have actionable and helpful takeaways to bring to your respective work and your lives with your children with Sanfilippo syndrome.
Just to echo Glenn's thanks to everybody and the incredible turnout, the engagement, the connections that have been made, everyone who took time to prepare information for our community and be here and present it, and all of you who have interacted with it. It's really incredible, and we thank you for that.
Yeah, and at the end of 2 days, I don't think anyone wants a long, drawn-out speech, so we're not going to do that, but we are going to leave you with a short video we'd ask you to watch. This video is the reason why we have this conference, and it's truly what it's all about. It's about a parent's unconditional love for their children. It's about hope and about the hard work with the belief that better days are possible. Thank you all so much for participating in all you do to help make this a reality. Thank you so much.